Donnel is probably the most overrated unit in the history of Fire Emblem. I have never seen anything like this in any other game. The gap between how bad he actually is and how much some people hype him up has got to be wider than any other character. As a community, we seem to be able to recognize when a unit is bad, most of the time. Sophia is really bad because when she joins, she's incapable of fighting anything and requires an absurd amount of babying, but that also applies to Donnel. Amelia is really bad because even if you invest all of this effort into training her, she just becomes a maybe equal or probably even worse version of your other Cavalier Paladin candidates, but this again also applies to Donnel. So why do people hype him up as if he's actually good, or even great, or even the best? The comment sections of Reddit, YouTube, and most likely even this video are filled with testimonials from people talking about how Donnel completely, single-handedly steamrolled their game, and how he is the most broken character in Fire Emblem Awakening. So how did this happen? How does a character who is so bad, even and especially within the context of his own game, get such a reputation? If Donnel is really the worst unit in Awakening, which I believe to be true, and it's not even close, I need to first prove that to you, and then we can talk about how and why this phenomena happened. And I know this comes across as arrogant, but I have to stress that Donnel is truly, objectively, mathematically a bad character. This isn't a disagreement about opinions, it's a complete disconnect with facts. And I'm not even trying to crap on Donnel just to make people feel bad about liking him. It's just fascinating to me that he's so bad. And so many people seem to be incapable of realizing it, or even once you've pointed it out to them, still incapable of accepting it. He has bad bases. He has bad combat. He has a very small number of builds that he can actually run. And every build that you want him to run requires more resources than any other character trying to do the same thing, and once he gets there, he has fewer options to expand his viability. Before we go any further, I want to say that if you enjoy using Donnel, if you like him as a character, this is totally fine. I'm not trying to argue that you shouldn't like him. I'm not even trying to argue that you shouldn't use him. I'm just arguing that he is bad. It's okay to like a bad unit. It's fine to use a bad unit. If anything, I've always considered it a compliment if someone calls one of my favorite units bad at the game, because I was able to beat the game with an inferior character. That's essentially the essence of a challenge run. Being able to win with bad units and bad tools just proves that I'm a good player. Now, no matter what I say to try and keep this discussion reasonable, people are going to get upset. So I'm not going to waste any more of my time trying to address anyone that is completely unwilling to accept how bad Donnel is. For the rest of you, let's get started. Number 1, horrific bases. Now, I used words like objective and mathematic earlier, so I have set a pretty high bar for this video. This is not going to be like my normal character unit guides where I convey general ideas without getting too bogged down in the numbers to help you make decisions. I'm going to back up my statements from earlier and mathematically prove just how bad Donnel is. First of all, let's start with his stats. His starting HP is 16. This is worse than every other character in the game, worse than Miriel, Lisa, and Maribel. His starting strength is 4. This is worse than every other physical attacking character in the game, and even if you want to compare him against the magic users, it's barely higher than the weakest of them. By the way, on that note, his starting level of 1 is actually a huge downside. In this game, every character can gain infinite levels anyway. Starting at a lower level doesn't really benefit you in any sense. It doesn't give you extra levels to grow, and in fact, being able to switch classes or promote at level 10 is the most important thing that a character can do. The sooner you can get there, the better. And Donnel actually wants to get to level 10 and switch classes more than any other character. So putting him the furthest possible away from that point just makes this training which is already brutal, even harder than it needs to be. Anyway, let's continue. His starting skill is 2. This is worse than any other unit in the game. We're going to hear this phrase a lot. His starting speed is 3. This is worse than any other unit in the game. He's 2 points slower than Kellum, okay? His only good stat is luck, and this is the worst stat in Awakening. It's completely pointless in 99 out of 100 cases. We're going to talk more about this later because it relates to a specific skill. The luck problem is actually a preview of one of the biggest issues with Donnel. We're going to talk about this later on when we get to growths and when we get to caps, but for now, just keep this preview in mind. All of Donnel's stats are loaded into the luck category, and luck is bad. His base defense is 3. Now, this actually is not the worst in the game. It's just tied for the worst. Along with Lisa, Maribel, and Miriel, they all have 3 defense as well. But they all have more HP, they all have more resistance, and they all have more speed, which is a very important defensive stat. So they're all still more tanky than Donnel is. I don't consider res to be a super important stat, but it is really worth mentioning that Donnel, who is just bottom tier at everything else, also has a 0 resistance stat, which is tied for Vake for the worst in the game. Again, this kid literally has nothing that he is good at. It's just luck and nothing else. Okay, I hear you. I know exactly what you're thinking, saying, or typing in the comment section right now. Donnel is a growth character. His bases don't matter. Well, here's the thing. In order to grow, you have to be capable of generating experience without immediately getting deleted from existence by any foe that comes anywhere near you. Again, it's really worth stressing that pretty much every single character in Awakening is a growth character. Chrom, Robin, Lisa, Sully, Virion, Stahl, Vake, Miriel, Sumia, Rickon, Maribel, Noe are all unquestionably growth characters. And there's a few that I left off this list who could be considered growth characters as well. The big reason why people overrate Donnel so much is because of this. Almost every character in this game is going to become good if you invest a ton of effort and resources into them. So they invested all of this effort into Donnel, and then he becomes good, and so they come to the conclusion, well, he must be the best, he must be really good. But the problem is that if you did this with any other character, if you gave them the same amount of experience, the same amount of favoritism, they're going to turn out just as good as Donnel, at the very least, good enough to perform the role that you need them to do. Do you need proof? Okay, well, let's look at every single Awakening playthrough that didn't use Donnel. The other non-Donnel characters seem to be performing just fine. Being a growth character does not make Donnel special. In fact, the only thing that's special about him is that he is more difficult to train than all of these other characters, and he requires more resources to get to the point where he's actually viable. Keep in mind that using Donnel also requires the use of an early second seal. This is an extremely limited, extremely precious resource. Almost every character in the early game wants this seal, including Frederick and Robin, and if you give it to Donnel, you're taking it away from a character who is better than Donnel. But you know what? Instead of comparing Donnel's horrendous base stats against the other growth characters in his own game, let's compare him against a character who is universally considered to be bad. If I can prove that he's just as bad or even worse than a character who everyone agrees is bad, okay, well, let's face it, there's plenty of people who are still not going to be convinced, but still, let's do it anyway. Number 2, the Wendy Paradox. Early on, I mentioned that we as a community can recognize and accept when a unit is bad, and I listed a few examples. And another great example of this is Wendy from Fire Emblem 6. I doubt there's almost anyone who could try to make any argument for her actually being good. And I feel like this comparison is really going to hammer home the crazy amount of cognitive dissonance that people have when it comes to Donnel. Donnel has 3 less HP than Wendy. He has the same strength as Wendy. He has 1 less skill than Wendy. He has the same speed as Wendy. He has 5 less defense than Wendy. Oh, and let's not forget, he has 1 less resistance than Wendy. Did you notice that I did not use the word more a single time in that entire paragraph? That's because Donnel has the same or worse stats than Wendy, in every single stat that matters. The only stat which is higher is again luck, which is again the worst stat in Awakening that does almost nothing. We can all agree that Wendy is bad. Now, Donnel is mathematically worse than Wendy in every single way. So why can't we agree that Donnel is bad? But Ellery, this isn't a fair comparison. They're from different games. Well, actually, I agree with you 100%. This is not fair. To Wendy. Because in Awakening, the enemies are significantly more dangerous than the enemies in FE6. So not only are Donnel's stats worse than Wendy, but he's also fighting against more powerful threats. Don't believe me? Okay, let's get started. In Wendy's joining chapter, the thieves can have between 12 and 16 speed, depending on their stat rolls, and they have between 3 to 5 strength with iron swords. So assuming they high roll in every single important stat, they have 16 speed and 5 strength, which is actually still lower than the Awakening thieves. In Donnel's joining chapter, the thieves have 19 speed, always. They don't even need to high roll to get this. They just have better stats in every single case. They also hit harder, with 9 strength and steel swords that do not weigh them down. What if Donnel avoids fighting the thieves? Well, let's ignore the fact that there's a thief who starts right near him and will kill him immediately if you give him the chance. Donnel is also surrounded by a bunch of other enemies who can also kill him and want to do so, and they're more dangerous than anything else that Wendy has to fight in her join chapter. Let's look at the least dangerous enemies in both maps. On a max stat roll, the archers in Wendy's chapter have 10 speed and 11 strength with steel bows. Actually, that's not true. They don't really have 11 speed in any sense that actually matters, because their steel bows weigh them down, making them effectively a bit more slow than that. But let's pretend that's not even true. Let's pretend they actually have the max stat roll in every stat that's important, and they have steel bows that don't weigh them down. In that case, they would have 10 speed and 11 strength. It doesn't even matter, because the archers trying to kill Donnel still have 11 speed and 11 strength, so they're faster and just as strong, and they actually have steel bows that really don't weigh them down in the game that they exist in. These archers, by the way, are considered to be the safest enemies to train Donnel against. You have to pin one of them in a corner and surround him on all sides, so that Donnel can repeatedly hit him over and over again to gain experience. There is no other safe way to train Donnel. I mean, come on, at least Wendy can enemy phase one weak opponent at a time. Donnel has nothing that he can safely trade a single round of combat with. Not even the sword users in the upcoming chapters. The mages that are trying to kill Wendy have 9 speed, 10 attack with basic fire tomes. There's no equivalent on Donnel's map, but it's okay because a lot of the barbarians that are surrounding him at the very start of the map, they have 11 speed, 16 strength, and they have short axes that are way more capable of cutting down Donnel at 1 to 2 range. This comparison essentially just continues the further you go down this line. I'm not going to harp on the same point over and over again, but I just have to say that if you take the time to train Donnel on this map, and you give him the maximum possible experience, which I have personally done before, he still gets doubled and one-shot by almost every single enemy on the next map. It's not like this is a one-chapter training arc, okay? Forget about Wendy. Donnel might actually be worse than Sophia. At least Sophia can attack things at 2 range safely. Oh, and by the way, on that note, Wendy starts with D rank and lances, while Donnel has E rank. Not only is he incapable of using the javelin right away, but it's actually worse than this. Because, you see, when you finish training Wendy, she promotes directly into a general. This is a payoff. This is a class that allows her to keep her lance rank and gives her better bases. She gains the ability to use axes. Donnel is unfortunate. Donnel is not so lucky. Number 3, weapon ranks. Donnel has to train in a lance-locked class until he gains enough levels to switch classes. He cannot promote right away. Instead, he has to swap to a parallel class and then train as a base class again to get into a promoted class at some point in the distant future, while also having to switch over to a new weapon type and rebuild from scratch. That's the problem. They seem to have figured this out in Fire Emblem 8 and then completely forgotten what they were doing in Fire Emblem 13. See, Ross, Ewan, Amelia, all of them have to spend 10 levels as trainees before promoting into a base class. It's the same idea as Donnel, but it's executed very differently. Ross advances from an axe-using trainee to a warrior and a pirate, axe-using classes. Amelia goes from a lance-using trainee to a cavalier and a knight, lance-using classes. Ewan starts with anima magic, he can promote to a mage, which also uses anima, or for some reason you can turn him into a shaman, he completely forgets how to use anima, and he has to start rebuilding with dark magic. You know, it sure would be bad if Donnel had to go through something like that, wouldn't it? Actually, Donnel doesn't have a choice. After Donnel promotes, he can never use a lance ever again. All of the lance rank you gained while training him through Villager ends up being completely pointless. Donnel promotes into either mercenary or warrior, sword and axe using classes. By the time Donnel is able to fight at 1-2 range with his javelin, he gets to completely reset his weapon rank and go back to training with E-rank swords and E-rank axes, losing his 1-2 range ability, and forcing him back into close range quarters with enemies. There is a little known and lesser used mechanic in this game where if you train someone to level 30 in a special class, they can directly swap over to a promoted class line. However, there's a reason this is barely used even by the people who know about it. This technique is most useful for Olivia if you're dance grinding. It is somewhat useful for Noe in legitimate building, and you can make an argument to maybe have Pan do this, although it's probably not a very good idea. It is a truly dreadful idea for Donnel. Villager is such a bad class. You want to get out as fast as possible. And because you have no advanced classes that use lances, you need to start training your sword or axe rank as soon as possible anyway. So you can't afford to delay this promotion for 19 extra levels. So what do we have here? I'm not even comparing Donnel against the growth units in his own game anymore. I've started comparing him against some of the worst units and some of the other really bad baby training project units from other games, and he looks worse than all of these characters in every single case. He has worse combat than Wendy. He has worse 1-2 range availability than Sophia. He has worse reclassing options than the trainees from FE8. I guess he looks better than Nino. That's about all you can say about Donnel. The difference is that nobody is claiming Nino is the strongest, most broken character in FE7, but for some reason, dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people are under this delusion that Donnel isn't just good, but they actually believe he's one of the strongest characters. So again, how did this happen? To explain that, I need to explain what is good about Donnel, and why he's actually still worse than every other contemporary character in the same roles. Number 4, soul tanking. Donnel is basically not capable of running any S-tier builds in this game, but he can use at least one of the A-tier builds, and this is the soul tank. This is less reliable than Nosferatu tanking, but it can be cheaper and it can be more versatile. However, it's still definitely a lower tier than Nosferatu tanking. I also have to stress that Awakening does not have a very wide meta. Most characters have one or more A-tier builds they can run, and a lot of characters can run at least one of the S-tier builds. As a result, almost every single character in this game is probably just like A-tier or S-tier. There really isn't anything below that. Again, Donnel having access to one A-tier build, the Soul Tank, does not make him special. If anything, what makes him special is that he only has a single A-tier build and no other options. He's missing the skills you need for every single other good build in this game, and in fact, he doesn't even really have a complete soul tanking kit. You see, we touched on this earlier, but I didn't quite go into detail back then, because I wanted to wait and give this discussion the proper focus that it needs. Donnel has the fewest promoted class options of every character in this game. This is because Villager takes up one of his 3 class slots, so most characters have something like Cavalier, Knight, and Wyvern, and each of those classes gives 2 promoted options. Now sometimes you do get overlap, and as a result, most characters have somewhere between 4 and 6 promoted class options. But Villager doesn't promote, so he's already down 2 classes compared to the average character, and you might be thinking, Noe and Pan have the same problem, and they do, but unlike Donnel, they have completely distinct class lines. Donnel is the only one out of this trio who has overlap. Noe's Mage class gives her Sage and Dark Knight, her Wyvern gives her Wyvern Lord and Griffin. Pan's Thief class gives her Trickster and Assassin, and her Wyvern gives her Wyvern Lord and Griffin as well. Now, if you're good at counting, you'll notice they have 4 classes each. This is on the low end, but it's still in the same range as most other characters. Donnel has Mercenary and Fighter. Mercenary gives Bow Knight and Hero, Fighter gives Warrior and Hero. Because there's an overlap here with both of his classes granting Hero, means that Donnel really only has 3 classes: Bow Knight, Warrior, and Hero. Again, if you're good at counting, you might recognize that 3 is lower than 4. It's actually the lowest of any character in the game. I'm not going to trash these classes, they're actually great. For having only 3 classes, they're all individually good. But characters aren't made up of just their final class. They're made up of a lot of small parts that go into making a complete build. Generation 1 characters tend to be missing 1 or more parts of this complete build, and with Generation 2, you get to mix and match your class sets and skill inheritance as needed to make a more optimized unit. In the ideal case, to be a great Generation 1 character, you want to only be missing 1 or hopefully not missing any skills that you need to run a complete A tier or S tier build. But the fewer classes you have, the more likely you're going to be missing some of these skills. If this was one of my normal unit guides, I would feel content just giving you guys this overview and letting that information sink in. More skills are useful, Donnel has fewer classes, therefore Donnel has fewer skills. But this video is special. I'm not going to rest until I meet my very high standards for proof in order to make sure you fully understand just how bad Donnel really is. Number 5, lack of skills. Yes, Soul is good. We get it. It's not great, but it is good. But it's definitely not an S tier skill. And Donnel is not the only person who has it. The only good thing about Soul is that it's pretty easy to get. So first, let's start with Soul. There are 4 viable Soul tanks in the game if we include Donnel. Realistically, it's actually like 2, but let's include everyone just for the sake of fun. I'm not going to include anyone who joins at the very end of the game for obvious reasons. I want to talk about characters that actually help you during the course of a playthrough, help you get through the difficult chapters 9, 10, 11, 12. You have Donnel, Gregor, Cordelia, Gaius, and Vake. Dark mages can use the Nosferatu Tome by simply gaining dark magic access, but Soul tanks need to actually level up until they learn Soul. Learning this skill as quickly as possible is one of the most important components of having a Soul tank come online. I was going to tally the levels of base class and promoted classes each character needs to get Soul, but the good news is that all of the characters learn Soul at level 5 hero, so if we just assume that the 4 levels in the hero class are added on top of everyone's leveling path, you can cancel these out on both sides. Let's focus on how many levels each of these characters need to train through base classes in order to access hero so that they can start learning Soul. Donnel requires the most amount of training with 18 levels at minimum, Gaius requires 14 levels at minimum, and Cordelia requires 12 levels of training. Now, what's very interesting is that people often don't consider Gaius or Cordelia to be useful in the Soul tanking role because they require too many levels and you have to reset their weapon rank to a class where they have E rank weapons. It's crazy that this same argument very obviously applies to Donnel, except he's even weaker in combat than Cordelia or Gaius, and he has to train for even more levels, but for some reason, people have convinced themselves that Donnel is somehow good. I can't even wrap my head around that one, but anyway, Vake requires only 8 levels of training, and is one of the standout candidates here, because he's going to promote directly to hero with the ability to use hand axes, and most likely steel and even killer axes as well at the end of a very short training arc. Anyone else who wants to do this needs to train for a longer amount of time. Last up, we have Gregor. He requires 0 levels to train into the hero class. I would need to divide by 0 and break my chart in order to display how much easier it is to train Gregor than it is to train Donnel. And now I know, all of the Donnel fans are just cackling with glee at this moment. This is what you've all been waiting for. I've been a complete fool by comparing Gregor directly to Donnel. You see, Donnel is a growth character. It might take him longer to train, but he'll eventually be better than Gregor. He'll be better than Vake. Right? He will, right? I mean, that's what this whole thing is about. This entire argument would be completely pointless if he wasn't actually better than... Oh god, he's not actually better, is he? Number 6, misleading growth rates. Let's get right into it. Donnel's total growth rates are high, even I can admit that, but they're not as high as you might expect, especially when you look at what they really do. After factoring in aptitude, his total growths of 485 pretty much tower over everyone else. Even Noe, the exceptionally growth-weighted character, only has 360 total growth. The average is only 299, and this is with Donnel dragging the average up as an extreme outlier. So this looks pretty good, right? Well, yes and no. 160 of those points are coming from aptitude, and not all of that value is going into the stats that you care about. People often say that aptitude as a skill is like gaining an extra 2 points of stats every 10 levels, and while that's technically true, sometimes people misunderstand what this means. I mean, it's an extra 2 points compared to what? Himself? That doesn't really matter. Donnel doesn't exist in a vacuum anyway. What really matters is how Donnel with aptitude compares to other characters, not how he would compare to himself without aptitude. And while his total growth line is high, remember that not all stats are made equal. I gave you a little preview earlier, and so now we're finally here to discuss one of Donnel's biggest problems. His high growths aren't particularly balanced in a useful way, and aptitude is shoveling a lot of further growths into stats that don't matter, making him seem a lot more impressive on first glance, but then this peasant emperor's false crown starts to come off when you look more closely. If you gave aptitude to Vake, he would be way better than Donnel is. Even though Donnel's total growths at 485 are actually 195 points higher than Vake's 290, this seems like an insane advantage, but a lot of that growth is tied up in stats that don't matter: magic, luck, resistance. While Donnel is one of the very small number of characters in the game who can take advantage of the luck stat, it's still absolutely not a good stat, and certainly not comparable with things like speed, strength, and HP. If we remove magic, luck, and res from the equation, Donnel's total growths in just the important stats, HP, strength, speed, skill, and defense, and yes, I'm even including skill, which gives Donnel an advantage, this puts his total to 315, while Vake's adjusted total is still a comfortable 230. Now Donnel is still higher, but the gap has shrunk considerably. Donnel was up 195 points before, but he's only up by 85 points now. So aptitude and his high growth rates aren't really making him 195 points better than other characters. It's really more like 85 points. And this is still an advantage, but it's simply nowhere near as big as people are claiming it to be. 70 HP Donnel versus 60 HP Vake and Gregor, 55 defense Donnel versus 40 defense on the other two, 65 strength on Donnel, 50 strength on Vake. Honestly, that's pretty good. But if you look at the stats that actually matter, and you compare Donnel against his actual competition, instead of comparing himself against himself, aptitude never really gives him that 2-point stat advantage every 10 levels. It's a little bit misleading to think of it that way. Also, Donnel's higher stats don't actually matter as much as you might think in this mid-game section, where growths matter. Despite his higher growths, he only has a few extra points, which typically don't change the outcome of the enemy phase, or player phase. For example, if Vake has enough speed to double an enemy, then Donnel having 4 or 5 more speed than Vake doesn't change anything. Both of them still double the same enemy. This is because stats in Fire Emblem work based on benchmarks. After a certain point, going any higher doesn't change anything as long as you've hit your benchmark. Speed is a great example of this because you either double or you don't. But most of the stats actually work in a similar way, even if you just have to think of it indirectly. For example, increasing Donnel's strength by around 4 points ahead of Vake doesn't allow him to one-shot the enemy, so even though Donnel's strength is higher, he's still killing the enemy in 2 attacks. He has more strength than Vake, but he effectively has the same offensive power. In the mid-game, it becomes very difficult to one-shot enemies, and so neither Vake or Donnel is really going to do it, or in cases where they can, against the more frail enemies, typically both of them can do it. The thing is that having above average stats really matters at 2 points in the game. In the beginning, having higher stats is good because everyone's stats are so low and the enemy stats are so low, even 1 extra point can be a difference maker. But at the beginning, Donnel is really weak. He's the weakest, as we discussed. And at the end of the game, your combined class caps and personal caps are really going to determine your effective combat capabilities against endgame and postgame enemies who also have capped stats. But in the middle of the game, when Donnel is likely to have the biggest advantage in stats, when his high growth rates are putting him slightly above the other characters, before everyone else starts to catch up to him and everyone hits their caps and everyone starts to look the same, this is the point in the game when having higher stats matters the least. During this section, any trained character is going to double enemies, and any trained character is going to two-shot, but they're not going to one-shot enemies. And Donnel doesn't break this trend. His stats aren't high enough to actually matter. So again, his inflated growths just look nice and make you feel good, but they don't really do anything. And unlike Noe and Pan, who always keep their great growth rates no matter which class they switch into and which skills they have equipped, a lot of Donnel's value comes from needing to have aptitude equipped at all times. I guess since he has no good skills, this isn't such a huge downside. Number 7, no good skills. So let's move away from Soul and start talking about more complete builds. What do they look like? And why is Donnel just absolute trash as a character? If you train him, he will eventually become awesome. That's what everyone believes. The problem is that every single character in Awakening has this same argument. The characters in this game are all very strong. They're all capable of getting very high stats and running very powerful builds. Again, having one powerful build doesn't make Donnel special. Again, the only thing special about him is that he has the most incomplete build of anyone in the game. So let's talk about what actual good skills are. First of all, I'm going to remove Gale Force from the list. It would be unfair to Donnel for 2 reasons. Number 1, most of the characters you're comparing Donnel against actually can't get Gale Force either. It has very limited availability in Generation 1, so it would be a waste of time, and I'm not going to hold that against him. But number 2, Gale Force isn't really that great on a soul tank anyway. You would want 5 other skills equipped that are going to increase the consistency of your soul tanking. I mean, it's useful to be able to kill something and then reposition, but it's just not that powerful of a synergy for a character whose job is to stand in one place and tank a bunch of attacks on enemy phase. They're not focused on player phase removal. Let's move down the list. What a soul tank really wants is evasion, hit, and crit boosting skills, along with flat damage increases. They don't want other proc skills. For that reason, he doesn't really need Luna or Astra, although he couldn't get those either, even if he did want them. Start getting used to that statement, because Donnel just isn't going to be able to get almost every single good skill that we ever talk about. It's going to be a common theme, just like with him having all of the worst stats. Let's start with the hit, evade, and crit skills. Hex and Anathema give a hit and a crit bonus. Donnel can't get them. He could have a partner with Anathema, but the same argument applies to everyone, so at best he's just net 0 on this skill. At worst he's less good than the characters who can bring Anathema to their own pairing, like Robin. Vake and Gregor can't get this one either, so you know what, I'll go ahead and mark this as net 0. Patience gives hit and evade on enemy phase, which is useful for a soul tank, and you get it from Mercenary anyway, so Donnel can get this one. It's actually one of the few good skills that Donnel has access to. Gregor gets it automatically. Donnel actually needs to make a choice. He could either train through a more difficult class line if he wants this. Axe Breaker is a great skill, but all heroes get this, so if you're a soul tank, you're going to get this eventually anyway. Zeal is a nice, flat, critical hit bonus. Donnel can actually get this one too. Vake, again though, Vake gets it automatically. Donnel has to choose if he wants to train through this line, but it is the easier training line, and it is the line that gives him hand axes, so there's a good chance your Donnel will end up with Zeal if you know what you're doing. Gamble and Wrath give very powerful crit bonuses. Donnel cannot get them. Vake and Gregor can get both of these skills. Think of Wrath as a more powerful Vengeance, except Vengeance and Soul can't even trigger at the same time, but Wrath and Soul can. For that reason, Wrath is an extremely powerful tool for a soul tank, and Donnel just cannot get it. Worst of all, Vake and Gregor are the 2 candidates who are most heavily competing with Donnel for this role, for the soul tanking position. The fact that both of them can get Gamble and Wrath, while Donnel cannot, is a very heavy point against him. It's probably one of the worst, other than the thing that we're going to talk about at the very end. Lucky 7 is a very substantial hit and avoid bonus. Gaius can get it, Donnel cannot. Donnel has access to a unique skill called Underdog, which can boost his hit and avoid rate against enemies with a higher level. Most experts of the game consider this skill to be extremely unreliable and very bad, especially because if you want him to soul tank, it's very likely that he needs to be a high level, so he's not really going to have the Underdog condition. I think this skill is a little bit underrated because you can control for it by resetting Donnel's level to 1. However, it's not reasonable to keep resetting his level over and over again. It's just very expensive, and you have to gain way more experience than you can ever possibly gain. So the skill is just a little bit underrated. It's still not very good, and it's probably not even worth spending extra levels in Villager just to obtain it. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of great skills are the fair skills, and these are universally good, and this is the worst thing against Donnel. Fair skills add a flat damage to all of your attacks, which accelerates your offense in a very measurable way. You're hitting for harder, you're removing more enemies, and if you're relying on soul healing, you're also going to be healing yourself for more. It's just a win-win-win situation. Donnel cannot get any fair skills. Cordelia, Gregor, Gaius, and Vake can all get at least one fair skill. This is a huge disadvantage of Donnel that I never really see anyone talk about. It's one of the biggest problems that comes with his limited class set. But you see, it's not just these 4 characters, but the problem is even more apparent when you expand your lens. Remember when I mentioned that Donnel has the smallest class set of anyone in the game? Here are the characters who can learn at least one fair skill. Robin, Crom, Lisa, Sully, Virion, Stahl, Vake, Miriel, Sumia, Kellum, Lonku, Rickon, Maribel, Gaius, Cordelia, Gregor, Noe, Libra, Saria, Anna, Olivia, Church, Henry, Sayri, Tiki, Basilio, all of the Generation 2 characters. No matter who their parent is, all of them can learn at least one fair skill. It does not matter who their parent is. Now here's the list of characters who cannot learn any fair skills. Donnel, Frederick, Pan, and Flavia. Do you see the problem here? Because we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Without a fair skill, Donnel is 5 points of damage behind almost every single character in the game, and most importantly, all of the characters he is directly competing with for the soul tanking position. It's just 5 points, right? He could make up for that difference with his inflated growth rates. Well, I'm sorry guys, but you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Is Donnel a growth character, or is he not a growth character? Because if Donnel is a growth character, then the crux of your argument rests on this statement, which we have said over and over again. Donnel takes more effort to get going, but he will eventually be better than Vake and Gregor. Except that's not true. He'll actually be worse than Vake and Gregor. At the endgame, at peak performance, Donnel is worse than Vake. He is worse than Gregor. And while the lack of a fair skill plays into this, it's actually not the entire reason why. You see, aptitude is moderately useful during the course of a playthrough, giving you a bit of extra stats over time, until you hit your caps. Then you start to run into a few problems. First of all, you need to remove aptitude and replace it with a better skill. But Donnel doesn't really have a lot of good skills, so what are you going to replace it with? Soul, Axebreaker, Armsthrift, Zeal? That's 4 skills. I guess you just stick something else on there. Patience is probably the best for the 5th option. This does not look like a complete build, guys. A complete build is usually way better than this in terms of whatever 5 skills they have. And then you realize that aptitude does not boost his caps. And Donnel's caps are atrocious. Number 8, horrible capped stats. Remember when I mentioned before that all of Donnel's growths are tied up in the luck stat, which is nearly useless in this game? Well, it's the same with his caps. Aside from a +3 luck modifier, all of Donnel's other mods are either underwhelming or outright negative. Donnel has +1 strength, -1 skill, -1 speed, +1 defense. Compare this to Vake. plus 3 strength, plus 1 skill, plus 1 speed, plus 0 defense. Now I don't know about you, but I would mathematically come to the conclusion that plus 5 is a better total set of combat mods than a net 0. Gregor also has plus 5 with 2 strength, 2 skill, and 1 defense. Cordelia also has plus 5 with 1 strength, 2 skill, and 2 speed. It seems like plus 5 is the standard, and Donnel is sitting on 0, and he doesn't have a fair skill, which is putting him like 10 points of value behind everyone else at endgame performance. Okay, I'm sorry, he's only 9 points behind Gaius, because Gaius has 1 strength, 2 skill, 2 speed, and minus 1 defense. So, hey, about Donnel eventually becoming really good and being better than all of these characters, how exactly is he going to do that when he has worse stats than all of them and less skills than all of them? You are free to have your own opinion about Donnel, but some opinions are just more correct than others. Some of them are just more based in reality than others. It is an objective, mathematical fact that Donnel has worse bases than every soul tank. He has worse weapon ranks than every soul tank. He has a harder training arc than every soul tank. He has fewer endgame classes and skills than every other soul tank. And he has worse endgame stats than every other soul tank. If you're going to tell me that this unit, who is weaker than Wendy, but he's fighting against enemies that are stronger than the enemies in FE6, is the best in Awakening, because he eventually becomes a worse version of his contemporaries with worse stats and worse skills, my only response is this. Donnel is literally a worse version of all of the bad qualities of Wendy, Amelia, and Sophia, all combined into one unit. There is no argument for anyone else in this game being worse than Donnel. He's a training project in a game full of training projects that are all easier to train and all become stronger than him. It's not like he's harder to train because he becomes better. No, stop making that argument. It's not true. He becomes worse. His endgame mods are terrible, and he passes down his bad mods to his children as well. Whether you're looking at the entire cast of Awakening, or if you're only comparing Donnel against other soul tanks, it doesn't even matter. He looks worse than every other character in the game. If you're just trying to get past Chapter 5, Donnel is the worst character to bring into one of your deployment slots. If you're trying to beat Apotheosis, Donnel is near the absolute bottom of the barrel of characters you would want to bring. He's probably the worst. Maybe at some point, somewhere in the middle of the game, if you're training Vake or you're training Donnel in 2 different timelines, there could be one moment in time for a few chapters where Donnel's performance, thanks to the extra 1.5 stats from aptitude, outshine Vake and give him a chance to do something that Vake couldn't do in some small way that matters, before Vake eventually just catches back up anyway. And so, after examining his bases, his growths, and his caps, we see a really unfortunate trend for Donnel. It's best to have high stats early on, but Donnel has the worst stats early on. The only time that Donnel's aptitude gives him a true stat advantage is during the middle section of the game, but this is the time where stats don't matter all that much, because everyone has enough stats, and having more than enough doesn't usually change anything. Then, at the end of the game, when caps start to matter, and they determine your endgame and your post-game performance, Donnel has terrible endgame potential with bad caps, and on top of that, he doesn't have enough skills to compete with other characters who want to run the same build, which puts him even further behind. He has like 10 less damage than everyone else, and he has like 30 less crit than everyone else. And even if he wanted to run something like Luna or Astra, he can't do that either. And finally, number 9, Armsthrift. If Donnel is the most overrated character in this game, then I have to say, by 1,000 country miles, Armsthrift is the most overrated skill in this game. Unlike Donnel, Armsthrift isn't actually bad. In fact, it's pretty good. I wouldn't go out of my way to get it, but I will use it on characters who have it. And I would consider adding a character to my team if they had Armsthrift. Their competition did not, and all of the other factors were equal. But still, it is crazy how overrated this is. But the problem with Donnel, as we've discussed above, is that all of the other factors are not equal. He is just strictly worse than every other character. In this game, luck is just essentially a worse version of speed, and other than that, there are 2 skills that use the luck stat. One is Miracle, which can allow a character to survive on 1 HP instead of dying. As a bailout option, it's better than having an empty skill slot, and honestly, it's better than having some other skills equipped. Depending on how much you value your time, how likely you are to play anything less than perfect, this skill could sometimes save you from a reset. Regardless, even with his amazing luck mod, growths and base, it doesn't matter, because Donnel can't get Miracle. The other skill is Armsthrift. So the way Armsthrift works is that it gives a pretty high % chance to not reduce your weapon durability when you attack with it. That counts if you're attacking or if you're the one being attacked, so it's very useful on enemy phase sweepers, because this happens very often. You're going to attack in this game dozens or even hundreds of times. You actually get a lot of chances for Armsthrift to activate, and unlike Miracle, which only comes up in very rare situations when you've made a mistake, also unlike Miracle, whether Armsthrift activates or not isn't really a huge deal in any individual case. Instead, it just generates value over time, because sometimes it will work, and that's good enough. There are some misconceptions around Armsthrift, though, which largely caused it to be as overrated as it is. I don't think this Armsthrift argument is going to be as objective as Donnel being a bad unit. That's based on strict numbers and math, where on the other hand, I do consider Armsthrift to be overrated. It is just my opinion, although it's also based on a lot of experience playing this game and understanding general ideas and broad concepts. It's not as easy to reach a consensus as +5 being better than +0. Having said that, I'll detail the reasons why I came to this conclusion about Armsthrift. So first of all, the game gives you plenty of weapons and plenty of gold. I've had some tight budgets before, especially when trying to equip a full roster of 10 or more characters in Lunatic Plus, but I've played this game a lot, and I've done a lot of no grinding runs, both on Lunatic and Lunatic Plus. I don't allow myself to summon spot pass characters to use those convenient shops. I use a very limited number of renown rewards, basically only the small collection of items that you get from beating the game once in order to unlock Lunatic Plus. And despite the fact that I almost never run any Armsthrift builds, I have never run out of money or weapons during the course of a playthrough. On both a micro level and a macro level, you're just very, very unlikely to ever break your weapons in this game at important moments. I think if you want to consider a skill S tier or even A tier, it needs to allow you to do something that is otherwise impossible. And Armsthrift simply does not accomplish that goal. It does not meet my standards for a top tier skill. All it does is allow you to use your existing strategies while caring a little bit less about how you spend your gold. It basically just allows you to not be good at budgeting. But here's the problem. Within the scope of a single battle, if you're worried about Nosferatu breaking, you just bring a second stack of Nosferatu. If you're worried about your killer bow breaking, you just bring a silver bow or a steel bow. Use the less expensive item when you don't need the extra damage, when you don't need the extra crit rate. And over the course of a playthrough, as long as you're good at managing your inventory, you'll pretty much always and constantly be rewarded with new, fresh items faster than you break your existing gear. Does anyone remember that one moment when you were playing Fire Emblem on GBA and you realized that your convoy was literally full of junk items and you have to start selling them or throwing them away to make space? This highlights the general philosophy of how items work in Fire Emblem. They give you gear at a faster rate than you actually break your items. Eventually, over time, your convoy becomes more full, not less full. So this idea that Armsthrift would somehow be needed or even helpful to fund a playthrough is extremely misguided. In fact, take a look at all of the playthroughs of the game that people have completed without Armsthrift. It really shows how non-essential this skill is. And even for the people who are using it, I really doubt that Armsthrift actually makes most playthroughs much easier, maybe slightly easier, but it's more likely the case that Armsthrift is just like a feelings-based skill. It makes you feel more secure, but if you go back and you run the numbers, you're going to find that it actually didn't change very much. You probably could have afforded the same items or at the very least, beat the game without the extra money. I'm not going to trash on Armsthrift as much as I've trashed on Donnel, because I do think it's a good skill. I just think it's like a B tier ability. It's a solid B tier. It's not even in the discussion for a top tier skill. One of the problems with Armsthrift as well is that the discussion around it lacks a real sense of focus on the important part. People often talk about characters with capped luck stats having a 100% chance to prevent their weapon from ever breaking, allowing you to create these super forged items that will never break. Okay, so honestly, there's at least 3 major problems with that statement. First of all, you're not going to have characters with 100% Armsthrift activation rates for the majority of the playthrough, even if you are using Donnel. It's extremely unfair and misleading to go around suggesting to people that this is the normal return on investment for running an Armsthrift build. Typically, characters are going to have like a 20% rate or less, and this does steadily grow over time, but it'll be like a 40 or 50% rate by the end of the playthrough. The luck stat just doesn't really get that high for most characters unless you're grinding them to an absurd level, which brings me to my other point. If you're grinding characters so much that they have a luck stat that's high enough to guarantee 100% Armsthrift activation rate, then you also have been grinding them enough that you just have enough gold to buy more weapons. What exactly is the point of saving weapons from breaking when you just finished grinding to the point of having infinite money so that you can now buy and forge whatever you want? And whether you're doing no grind or if you're grinding, either way, Armsthrift ends up not changing this equation very much. You either have enough money to buy what you want as long as you balance your budget, and sure, Armsthrift might allow you to be more careless with your spending, but that's the only real benefit. Or on the other side, you have infinite money and Armsthrift becomes completely irrelevant. In fact, the closer your rate becomes to 100%, the less good Armsthrift even becomes. Once your character becomes strong enough to have a guaranteed Armsthrift activation rate, they're also strong enough that they could pretty much beat any opponent without needing a super forged weapon anyway. And this brings me to my next point. Forged weapons aren't actually that amazing in this game. I mean, don't get me wrong, having a few extra points of might is better than not having it, but the overwhelming majority of your damage is coming from your strength and your magic stat. Early on in the game, forges can be pretty useful for hitting kill benchmarks, especially before you're able to buy tonics, but aside from that, their usefulness falls off over time. Eventually, enemies are going to have enough combined bulk that you can't one-shot them anyway, and you'll probably two-shot them without a forged weapon. Well, let's look at it this way. A bronze bow has 3 might, and a plus 5 bronze bow has 8 might. A 160% damage increase sounds pretty substantial, especially on a character who's going to be locked to E-rank bows and needs a good weapon to use while training. I actually think this is one of the better examples of a weapon forge, and it's not actually as impressive as I just made it sound. First of all, you have to consider something. Who is actually using this E-rank bow? It's not going to be Virion because he starts with D rank. A steel bow already has more might than the plus 5 bronze bow, and costs significantly less gold than forging a bronze bow all the way to plus 5. So the viability of these super forged E-rank weapons very quickly falls off with just a small amount of weapon rank grinding. Also, if you're switching someone like Crom over to Archer, or promoting Vake over to Warrior, they're probably going to have at least 10 strength, likely even more, but let's just use 10 for the sake of argument. So really what you're actually saying is that with a bronze bow, the character might have 13 attack, and with a plus 5 bronze bow, they would have 18 attack. Suddenly, this 160% damage increase, when you examine it in the context of how the combat formula actually works in the game, It's actually only a 38% damage increase. And remember, this is one of the better cases for forged weapons, these E-rank training weapons for characters, and especially bows. A silver bow's 13 might could be increased to 18, but the person using a silver bow likely has at least 20 strength already. Increasing 33 to 38 damage is now suddenly only a 15% in damage increase. The stronger your characters get, the higher their Armsthrift activation rates get, the less and less these small damage increases from forged weapons actually matter. In my opinion, the other best use case for forged weapons is to increase the crit rate. Typically on killer weapons and brave weapons, you won't get brave weapons until the very end of the game, and killer weapons are extremely expensive to forge. In fact, so are brave weapons. But yeah, if I was going to run an Armsthrift build, it would likely be for the case of making me feel a little bit better about forging max crit onto a killer bow or a killer axe, or max crit onto a brave bow or a brave axe, somewhere near the end of the game. But remember, if you're already at the end of the game, you're likely not going to break your forged weapons before killing the final boss anyway. So even if the forge is good, Armsthrift is actually not doing anything for you. Then it only starts to matter if you're grinding post-game content, which, again, if we're grinding, then saving money doesn't matter anymore, because now we have infinite money. Anyway, this gets me into the final misconception when it comes to Armsthrift. 100% activation rate is not even really that important. Saving any number of weapon charges is better than saving none. So this kind of undermines the point I've been making up until now, but I want to stress why Donnel's high luck is not really that good. Donnel has more luck than other characters, but it's not going to produce that much of a difference early or later on, just at the very end. And even then, it's not going to matter that much because they're going to have like 95%, Armsthrift, and he's going to have 100%. It's just, you don't really need 100% Armsthrift consistency in order to get value out of having Armsthrift equipped. So Donnel's high luck just doesn't matter, even in the cases where Armsthrift is actually good. Extending 20 Nosferatu charges to 30 Nosferatu is just good enough on its own. Extending them to infinity would be better, sure, but by the time it breaks, you likely have another Nosferatu tome that you can just replace it with. And by that time, you have plenty of gold to spend. So I don't think Armsthrift is bad, I just think it's a case where people are going so far out of their way to create this build that uses an item an infinite number of times without breaking it. But every character can just do that by just buying more copies of the same item. So in conclusion, Armsthrift is not bad, but it's very misunderstood and overrated. Unlike Donnel, who actually is very bad and very, very overrated. If you enjoyed this video, if you hated this video, or anything in between, feel free to leave a comment below. Also, I stream every Saturday, usually Fire Emblem Awakening, Lunatic Plus, so feel free to subscribe or stop by if you're interested in that. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.